So I'm going to finish up the week, spending today talking about the Great Depression, and then we've got a few practice questions to get through, and however long that takes us, we'll stop there. I don't want to go beyond that today. And then next week, we will definitely finish up U.S. history next week. So that's kind of the tentative plan. Let me go ahead and pull up handy dandy PowerPoint. Sure if either of you have questions, fire them my way or Caleb's, and make sure you're letting Caleb know in the chat that you're signing in. Kind of keep doing that. Let me cue up the slide for today. All right, so Great Depression. Again, there's lots of factors that go into the Great Depression, lots of things we could talk about, and it's a complicated topic, but we're just going to look at it on a surface level. So some of the causes of the Great Depression, things that led to the Great Depression. One of those things was overproduction. So we've talked a lot this past week about the boom during the late 1800s that kind of kept on chugging through World War I, through the 20s, and into the turn of the 1920s into the 1930s. There's this giant boom in production and manufacturing, and people were obsessed with making as much product as they could and doing it as efficiently as possible and as cheaply as possible so that as many people could buy it as possible. So America was infatuated with this for 40 or 50 years, and the economy was booming. But eventually, and when we talk about economics, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit, but economies go in cycles, right? You can only be booming as an economy for so long until something sets off a chain of events that sends you into a recession and sometimes eventually a depression, and then it cycles out of it. That's just the way economics works, the way economies operate, right? You can't sustain a strong economy forever. It's just not possible. So overproduction leads to producing a lot of stuff, and eventually they make so much of it that it outruns or it overperforms consumption. In other words, they're making more stuff than people want to buy. And so what you have happen is businesses have too much surplus. In other words, they have an excess amount of stuff and they start to lose profit. And so when businesses start to lose profit, they start to pay employees less, they start to fire employees or lay off employees temporarily or permanently, right? And that starts this kind of downward slide. Right? Pertinent times to be talking about this today because we're in a similar situation. Again, the results or the causes that led to it are greatly different, but there's lots of similarities between now and then, right? So we talked a little bit about yesterday how the prosperity in the 1920s was somewhat superficial or somewhat imagined. It wasn't really as successful as it was. And part of the issue was when we went to war during World War I, people got way back on the amount of stuff they bought, right? And everything was focused on the war. But what didn't happen, in which we learned our lesson in World War II and we avoided this problem, but in World War I, businesses just kept producing stuff. And because we were at war, nobody was buying it. And so these businesses started to have so much stuff and not enough people to buy it that they started to lose money, right? And it didn't happen overnight, right? This isn't something that happened overnight. The stock market crash did happen literally overnight or like in one day, but that wasn't the only thing that led to the Great Depression. There were lots of these underlying factors leading up to it. American isolationism. So again, we talked about how after World War I, the United States kind of retreated in amongst itself, right? Stopped trading with countries around the world as much. So businesses started to lose money from that, right? They were no longer making as much money selling to other countries. And so when this overproduction in the United States happened, it made this whole thing even worse. Let's see. No purchasing power. So, right, I think that's supposed to say rising prices. Stagnant wages means consumer money buys less, right? So, what this is or trying to explain is that the prices of goods slowly started to go up, right? And so you have this bubble that's about to burst, where you have the businesses they have too much, right? So they have too big of a supply. But instead of lowering prices, they just got greedy and continued to raise prices and raise prices. People's wages weren't working or weren't rising. So people that were working and buying these goods, they were making the same amount of money, but the cost of their goods was going up. And so even though there was a lot of stuff out there, businesses kept hiking the prices up. And again, it led to people stop buying stuff. Right? Eventually, workers couldn't afford to buy all these things. And businesses, before they realized it, boom, this collapse. Overexpansion of credit. So similar to what happened 10 years ago in the last time we had kind of a recession, there was an overexpansion of credit. In other words, people were given too much money lent out by banks. And so what happens then is you have a lot of phony money out there, right? You have people spending money they don't really have. And that's okay until it becomes too much, or until you lend out so much money that people can't pay you back as a bank. Banks start to lose money, and once banks fail, then we're into serious problems, right? A lot of this stuff is things we'll talk about when we get into the economics part of the GED test. But again, the Great Depression was essentially an economic issue. So this is kind of like a mini economics lesson in one day mixed in with you. On top of all of these things happening economically, the timing is also not very good because we have the Dust Bowl occur, which is a drought combined with a lot of issues that led to the Dust Bowl, which, remember, talked about the Dust Bowl or not? Losing track. I think there's a couple of practice questions that talk about the Dust Bowl that I just thought of right now. But my point is the Dust Bowl was kind of this drought combined with a failure of crops, partly from overproducing or over-harvesting, and harvesting too much and not replenishing the soil. So there was this massive shortage of crops that happened to occur right along with all of these other factors, right? So we have a dramatic situation where farms start to fail, right? Because they have nothing to sell. And there's a picture of that, right? There's just a picture of, and that wasn't literally what it looked like all the time, but there were more dust storms because there was this dry, loose soil that wasn't able to sustain crops. And so when the wind would kick up, it would cause these big dust storms. And that's where the name Dust Bowl comes from. All right. I want to go through a few more of these. Again, we talked a little bit about the credit. It was easy for Americans to get money, which was good until it wasn't, right? Again, this is the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. Not something you need to have in the back of your brain, but it basically depressed world trade. This is what we're talking about, right? So this idea that we're going to focus on ourselves and not focus on other countries, eventually came back to bite us because we weren't trading with these other countries, and we started to lose money because of it. And then we have the stock market. The famous stock market crash that really sends America into the Great Depression happens on October 29th, 1920. And so prior to that crash, we have what's known as a bull market, where stocks are overvalued. So again, I'm not a stock market expert. I don't claim to be. You don't need to be. All we need to kind of think about is, in general, the stock market was doing great, but people were overvaluing the stocks, meaning they were thinking that they were worth more than they really were, and so they were investing and investing and investing. And finally, there's this stock market crash, and when there's a crash in the stock market, sometimes what happens is this after effect of panic. And so because the stock market's crashing, people are in a hurry to sell off stock. And what does that do? That continues the drop even more, and so it just builds on itself. So eventually what you have happen is this giant crash where you have all of this kind of made up money that is invested in the stock market that's there one day and not there the next day, right? So you have banks going bankrupt, going under, you have businesses going under, and what does that do? That sets off this chain reaction, similar to what happened with our current situation, where whatever the circumstances, stock market crash sets off a panic, people are selling off stock, and businesses are shut down, banks are shut down, or banks fail. And so then we have kind of this massive unemployment. Again, not the same as what's going on now, and definitely different causes, but a similar effect, right? Or at least a comparable, right? So, all right. So long story short, we know that economy tanks and sends us into the Great Depression. That's really, all of that other stuff is detail that's important, but if you only take away one thing, just know that the Great Depression is basically an economic collapse, right? So the more important thing than really knowing what the causes of the Great Depression were, because that's good to know, but more important and more likely on the test, you'll see what are some of the impacts of it, right? So cause and effect. Causes were all those things that led to it happening, but once it happened, what were the effects of it, right? So you see a huge boom in homelessness in what we call shanty towns that were nicknamed Hoovervilles, that were mocking the president at the time, Herbert Hoover. You had a massive spike in unemployment. So the unemployment rate during the Great Depression, although it wasn't monitored quite as precisely as it is now, was estimated to be about 25%. In other words, 1 in 4 people were unemployed. Compared to now, the unemployment rate is right around 15%. So very high, the highest it's ever been since the Great Depression, but the Great Depression, even more substantial job loss, proportionate population than now. Okay? And disproportionately, African Americans were affected by the 60% unemployment among African Americans. So people started to lose their jobs. Disproportionately, minorities started to lose their jobs even more, right? Banks go under, and when banks go under, that means there's no one to lend money. And when that happens, there's just less money to be put into the economy, right? So it makes the process even worse, or it makes the issue worse. So we have hunger and starvation, right? Partly due to the Great Depression or the Dust Bowl, right? Because there's a shortage of crops. People even tried to, even though, and this is where it gets to be crazy, is because there was a shortage, prices went up. So the demand was up, so it was hard to get, Right? It was hard to get food. It was hard to get all these things. So they actually burned crops to make it drive the prices even more. They slaughtered pigs. So, and not that this was widespread practice, but people were coming up with all kinds of ideas to try to make money, even at the expense of, right, not giving food to people that need it. So that impacted families. Right? We saw a massive increase in suicides, abandonment, thriftiness for sure, right, and poor diet because people ate whatever they could. Some of you might be too young, but I know, like my grandparents' age, they still have lasting habits and things that they picked up from the Great Depression. Right? Crazy stuff, right? Like hoarding jars of food or piles of frozen things in the freezers, or having water boiling 24 hours a day. Like, who knows where these ideas came from, but they came from this period of intense economic hardship where people did whatever they could. And again, there was a lasting effect of how those people acted the rest of their lives. Probably how we'll be when we're 80 years old and people talk about all the crazy stuff that we do because of the coronavirus. Who knows, right? So, what did that do to politics? Well, here is a map of the election in 1928, so before the Great Depression, so before the stock market crash. You can see Herbert Hoover wins in a massive landslide. So again, Hoover is the Republican, Smith was the Democrat at the time, and he got only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states, right? Won the popular vote in 8 states. The rest was all for Herbert Hoover. So, Great Depression hits. Everyone goes from, booming in the 20s to now, oh, we're sunk, right? The next election cycle, 1932, look at that. Completely flip-flopped, right? Herbert Hoover gets destroyed by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? So just to kind of see, up here in 1928, Hoover wins 58% of the popular vote. A lot, right? That's a lot. Then, 1932, it's a little bit blurry, but I think that says 7. I can't read. Who knows? But you can see he disproportionately wins by a lot and then gets slaughtered, right? So that, and the Great Depression probably wasn't all his fault, but he took the brunt of the blame for the economic collapse that happened and the hardship that followed, right? So let's talk a little bit about, before we get into some practice questions, let's talk a little bit about post-Great Depression, or in other words, how we got out of it, right? So FDR wins the presidency, and he flips things around 180 degrees in terms of politically how he viewed the role of government and the role of government specifically in the economy. So he institutes what's called the New Deal, which maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't, right? And so over the, he had the first 100 days and then he had the second 100 days. And there was this intense period of activity and legislation where Hoover was trying to do things immediately to kind of pump money and jobs back into the economy. Right? So that was his biggest thing that he did right away, that he started acting, right? He started instituting jobs and came up with, and not just him, but him and the government came up with lots of policies that got put in place to help people out. Right? And a lot of them are things that still exist today that we kind of forget about or take for granted. He also started his fireside chats, where he would talk to people over the radio, just kind of reassuring people. And I think he did them. I can't remember. Anyway, FDR becomes immensely popular, and actually wins re-election 3 more times. So FDR is our only president to serve more than 2 terms. He served 4. And after FDR was out of office, he had the foresight to say, even though he was very popular, he won all these elections, let's maybe institute an amendment to the Constitution saying presidents only serve 2 terms, because they were worried about the office of the presidency getting too powerful. Side note there. So his New Deal focused around 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. So first was he needed to help out the banks. So he created the banking holiday. He instituted the Emergency Banking Relief Act that closed banks until they stabilized. Basically, he knew, and I'm not trying to account all of these things to him directly, right? A lot of this was government as a whole. They knew that without getting the banks up and running again, the economy couldn't. The banks were maybe not the first thing he targeted, but one of the biggest things. Okay? So he also created the FDIC, which regulated the banks. In other words, kept them accountable for their business operations and oversaw them to make sure that things were happening in a way that was sustainable. In other words, that banks weren't just giving out money left and right, or that they were practicing things that were in line with making sure the economy ran efficiently. There were also acts put in to control the stock market and regulate it as well. So you notice a lot of this has to do with regulation. So we talked about how in the 20s, the president's policies were typically to do nothing, right? Or to let the economy and let business do its thing. FDR did the exact opposite. FDR said, okay, we let businesses do what they wanted. We let the stock market do what it, fluctuate as it pleases. We let the banks do what they wanted. And where did that get us? So he said, we're going to regulate those areas, right? Regulate the stock market, regulate the banks, to make sure this doesn't happen again, right? That's an entirely different political philosophy than the previous president. Social Security was instituted in 1935. Social Security was direct relief, right? Money for the poor, elderly, and disabled, and also the idea of unemployment, right? Unemployment benefits came about in 1935. Before that, there was no such thing, right? The New Deal is probably most known for, and let me see where I'm at time-wise. The New Deal kind of involved a lot of that stuff that we just talked about, but the New Deal also is most known for job creation, right? The biggest thing was that FDR's New Deal was designed to put people back. And so to do that, they basically created new jobs, right? Just thought up new things that people could do, right? So you have this laundry list of federal agencies that are created to open up a lot of new jobs for people to have, right? So you have the Civilian Conservation Corps, right? That dealt with conservation, reforestation, firefighting. They built trails. A lot of the trail networks around our country were built during the Great Depression, right? As a part of the New Deal. The Agricultural Adjustment Act regulated farm production, offered subsidies. In other words, they paid farmers to make sure that farmers stayed in business, and they kept prices at a level where people could afford it, right? So it kept farmers from having to charge too much. Instead, the government basically said, we will pay you to make sure you continue to produce this crop at this price for the people so that they can buy it. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created, flood control, electricity, so you have dams being built all over the nation, right? The big boom in dams across the United States also occurs during this time as part of the New Deal, putting people back to work. Works Program Administration hired people and created jobs to build schools, to build roads, airports, libraries, right? So lots of these things that were government owned and government funded were built by people that worked for these new administrations. The National Industrial Recovery Act that was designed to set prices in different industries at a fair level. And you had the Public Works Administration, so money to states to provide jobs. So again, similar to what we have now going on is the government is pumping in a lot of money back into the economy in the form of stimulus money, right? Money given straight to people, trying to come up with new jobs to give to people, and definitely money to states to either A, put people back to work, or B, help keep industries open that are impacted, right? So all of these kind of things date back to the Great Depression and the New Deal, right? All right, let's see, do I wanna, I'll just touch on this real briefly and then we'll stop. So the National Labor Relations Act gave rise to unions by protecting workers' rights. So unions had been around before this, right? But really after the Great Depression and during this time, you see a rise in unions to make sure that not only the employers are being looked out for, but also the employees themselves. And you also have stuff like the minimum wage, reduced hours, limited child labor. So there were none of these standards in place prior to that. There was no minimum. There was no reduced hours. People could work as many hours as their boss told them they needed to work for their job, right? So again, all of these things we take for granted and think of as being obvious. They had to be invented. Someone had to come up with these ideas. And lots of these ideas around workers' rights and fairness came about from the Depression as a result of the collapse of the economy. And with that, I don't need to talk about the Supreme Court hacking. That's not something I necessarily need to talk about. Oh, that looks like the end of the. Oh, here's the end. So, last, and this is where I'll leave us. So I guess we won't get to practice. So do them next week. And anyway, the legacy of the New Deal, or in other words, the kind of lasting impacts of it. First was, again, the growth of big business, of big government, right? So the idea that government would stay out and let the economy kind of function on its own was a thing of the past, right? Now it would come back into fashion depending on which political party was in power, but in general, the New Deal really set a precedent for government's involvement in the economy and in everyday life, right? Thriftiness became a way of life. Again, like I talked about, people that lived through the Depression were changed, their habits were changed forever. You get the electrification of rural America, so literally what it sounds like. So because of all those new jobs and all those new dams that were built, you had way more electricity to provide to way more people. So you have people in rural America now living with electricity, which was something that you didn't have in mass, right? That was not a common thing prior to the New Deal. And then also, just from an economic standpoint, you get the opposite of the trickle-down economics that we talked about, whatever day that was, sometime this week, right? The idea that if businesses are doing well, then the employers or the employees and the workers must be doing well also, right? The idea that the economic success would trickle down to everyone below, right? The New Deal flipped that around and said, instead of waiting for money and profits to trickle down, the government would infuse the economy with money through lots of projects and providing new jobs for citizens. And that would then spur the economy because more people would have jobs, more people would have money, and more people would then put that money back into the economy by spending, right? A flip-flop of economic ideas. So with that, I'll stop here, and not tomorrow, next week, we will talk briefly about World War II and kind of finish up U.S. history. So that last point here says that World War II production, so in other words, when World War II hits, that spurs another big boom in production because people are having to make things for the war, and that really brings the Depression to an end, okay? So with that, I will stop there. Sorry for kind of rambling on more than I was planning, but I hope everybody has a good weekend. If I don't see you back for science class, enjoy the rest of your weekend, or enjoy your weekend, and I will see everyone on Monday. Again, if I don't see you for science at 1:15. So have a good one. All right, see you.